The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Travis McGrath. I'm the VP of Client Experience here at Exago. Today, I'm going to be leading a support lab on a feature that was released in our 2019.2 release called Custom Aggregate Functions. As I suspect, because I see a couple of questions coming in already, you guys know the routine here. Just to make sure everyone can hear me all right and can see my screen, you should be looking at a slide here with the title card and a mention of some technical skills. We'll talk to that in just a moment. So if you can hear me, you can see my screen, my mouse is moving, just put a yes, a hello, a good morning, something into the questions panel here. All right, coming through loud and clear, great. So as we dive in today, I do want to note a couple of things. As always, your questions are absolutely welcome. While everyone is on mute, the questions panel of GoToWebinar is on the right side of your screen. At any point, if you want more details, if you have a question, if you need something to be sort of repeated, feel free to go through that. This is meant to be a live, informative session. Also, this is a recorded session. So like all of our support labs, this will be posted on our knowledge base and our YouTube channel. So if you ever want to go back and see a topic we've already covered, or if something went a little fast and you want to hear about it, again, you can certainly come back and this will be a recorded session as well. So this year we're doing one lab every month and we're alternating technical labs and what we call sort of front end or end user labs. So today's lab is going to be fairly technical. We're going to get into a little bit of code. I'm going to do it in a way that I hope is approachable to everyone. So we're going to do some C# programming, but all the code's already written. We're not going to go writing code ourselves, so it shouldn't be too bad. We'll just walk through it line by line, explain what the code is doing, why it's doing it. We won't get into the exact syntax too deep. But if you have any questions there, please always feel free to ask. Okay, great. So with that, we'll kick it forward here. So the agenda, pretty simple. We're going to give an overview of what custom functions are, custom aggregate functions are, and how they differ from custom functions. We're going to show two examples, and we're going to show the code and then show them live running on Exago reports. And then there will be a few disclaimers and notes, just things to be aware of, and that'll be it. It should take whole lab should take about 15, maybe 20 minutes here. Great. So as an overview, a custom aggregate function is like a custom function. So custom functions in Exago are the ability to add formulas into our formula editor that a user can take while building advanced reports or express views or dashboards, and they can add to their content. And you can take individual rows of data and you can make calculations, you can generate images, you can manipulate as you see fit using custom code. Custom aggregate functions do the same thing, but instead of taking a single row of data, they store other values and then they provide one aggregated value, thus custom aggregate functions. So this is the same way we have aggregate functions built into the product. We have, the ag sum, ag count, ag average. Everyone on this lab, I imagine, has used those a lot of times. So the same concept here of custom functions, we're allowing you to expand that list of aggregate functions. A few notes though, while custom functions support JavaScript, custom aggregate functions are going to be only C# or VB.NET. So the programming is going to be a little different there. And the code is going to be kept in the admin console. We could talk to how you could move code into your own separate assembly, but there's going to be some important reasons to have most of the code in the admin console as well. Okay, so how does a custom aggregate function work? So the custom function, you give it the inputs, you get an array of arguments and the session info object, and you can manipulate that however you want, and then you return a value. A custom aggregate function, though, has to do something a little bit more sophisticated because we're not just given one array of inputs. If we're aggregating over many rows of data, we're going to have to store values, we're going to have to keep track of things. So what a custom aggregate function is going to do is we're going to implement an interface. In this case, it's called iCustomAggregator. And just think of this as, it's an interface. It's a coding term here in C# and, generally object-oriented programming. But really what we're doing is we're just creating something that we can create an instance of, and it's going to have two methods. Specifically, we're going to have a method called add value, and then we're going to have a method called result. And for each time you put a custom aggregate function into a section, Exago is going to instantiate the interface for each section. To make that a little less abstract, if you had a report, say, on customers, so your sections of the report had customer info, and you put a custom aggregate function in the footer of the customer group, you would have an instance of that interface for each customer, right? And we'll see that when we go through an example. Okay, so we said that there are two functions, the add value and the result. So first what I want to do is talk about the add value function. The add value function is going to be called as we go through the detail records. And it's going to take a couple of things. So it's going to be passed in session info. So just like our other extensibility features, if there's something you need specific to the session, you want to know who the user is, you want to change something based on culture settings or other parameters, you'll have access to that. We'll need a value to aggregate, and then any additional arguments. So looking at that in more detail, custom aggregates have two arguments by default. There's the value, what we call data to aggregate, and this is the value of that add value function. And then there's a optional Boolean called record level. And this I'll talk about in just a little bit. When we get into the admin console, I can describe what it does a little bit more. Beyond that, in the add value method signature, there's an array of additional arguments. So while they're all custom aggregates have to have these two arguments, you can rename them, of course, but these are the two that have to exist. You'll be able to add additional arguments if you want to pass more things in. Okay, so what we're going to do is do this using examples. Everything I've said so far, pretty abstract, a little hard to wrap your head around. It'll get a lot easier if we can look at an example. And so what we're going to start with is an add concatenate. And this is going to be pretty simple. The goal of this function is just to take whatever values you give it and put them all into a list. In this case, we're going to have a comma-separated list, but we'll let the user choose if they want to have a different delimiter between those things. All right, so that sounds pretty simple. So let's see. Let's go over to our admin console. And right off the bat, I'm just going to mention, actually, I'm going to do a refresh just so I have a live session here. So if I go down to my extensions, so I'll collapse some of the other things in the admin console. Like we have our custom functions, there are some built-in ones by default. Right beneath that, we have our custom aggregate functions. In this case, I've already built two, so we're not going to start any from scratch. But in here, this interface should look pretty familiar. We're going to give the function a name. We can give it a description. We can choose what folder of functions these go into. And of course, for aggregate functions, you're probably going to want to put them in the aggregate folder so that a user knows that it's an aggregate. And then we can choose the return type. In this case, we're just making a comma-separated list, so a string here makes a lot of sense. We can do a thing called prevent in database grouping. Don't worry about this. We can circle back to it towards the end of the lab and talk about it in more detail. And then the last part, this is the arguments we mentioned before. We have a couple by default. So we have our data to aggregate. This is just the value that we want to make our list of things out of. And we have our record level. And what this means is we can either aggregate for every unique row of data or every specific record. So we can say, for every row of data that comes back, aggregate, or use the unique keys in our data objects, in our groups, in our sorts. So in general, this is an optional record. And in most cases, it's just going to be defaulting to true, and you don't have to worry about it from there. In this case, we're adding an additional argument where a user could pass in a different delimiter. So since we're making, in our case, a comma-separated list, maybe you don't want to use commas, maybe you want to use a different delimiter. You can make that an optional argument, and the user can have that instead. All right, so those are the arguments that the user is going to pass in from the front end when they utilize this aggregate function. Before I dive into the code and how we're going to take these inputs, are there any questions so far? Okay, great. Don't see any questions, so we'll keep moving right along. All right, so in our code, in our case, we're programming here in C#, and in this case, we don't have any references or any specific extra namespaces, so we're just gonna move past those. But in our next example, we're gonna look at those in a little more detail. So to start with, we are creating the interface we talked about. So in this case, we have a class, calling it ag_concat, and it's building off of the Custom Aggregator interface. And in our case, this class has two properties that are going to be true to it across all the methods. So the first one is we're just building a string builder. So this is where we're going to keep the comma separated list as we build it out. And we have a delimiter. So this is effectively sort of our default value in case a user doesn't pass in any additional delimiter. If they don't want to change it from a comma, this just has, a comma and a space as a string. Okay, so now we have to implement two methods. So we're going to implement an add value and a result. So to start with, let's look at the add value. So add value passes in session info in case we want to make this different per user. I don't think we have any real reason to do that, but if we need to, it's there. We have a value. So this is going to be that first value being aggregated. And then we have a additional list of arguments, an array here if we need them. In this case, the only additional argument is the option to change that delimiter. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say, well, if we're making a comma separated list, we don't really care if something's null or blank because that's not going to mean much in the list. So we're going to do a simple check and say, hey, if the value we passed in was, string.empty, then just return. Don't worry about it. But it might be a little more than that. So then the other thing we're going to do is we're going to look for that optional change of the delimiter. So if there are any arguments, that means they've passed in an optional argument here. And in this case, we're just saying this dot delimiter is, args string 0 to string. So this is basically just saying what was the delimiter they passed in. And then to our string builder, we're going to append the value, and then we're going to follow that with our delimiter, either that comma or the optional value. So this function is going to be called for every record that's coming in a particular group. So again, if we go back to that report of sort of on our customers or on our orders per group, we'll see that, same comma separated value. We're not doing anything special about removing unique values or sorting or anything like that. This is meant to be sort of our simplest example. So add concatenate, it's just saying, every time you give me a value, I'm just going to concatenate it in using this add value function. So then when the function is done aggregating, we have all the detailed data. We're going to look at the result. So we have our second method here, our result method, and that's going to give us a return value. So in this case, we're saying the return value is the string builder just having that output to a full string. And then we're thinking about it, we always appended a delimiter. And if we think about it, the last delimiter we don't really need because it was the last value. So we're just going through and saying, hey, if the delimiter has any length, that is to say, if it's something that's going to show up on in our case, we're just going to remove it. And then we're going to use our ret value here. So this is a pretty simple example. It's just creating a string by appending whatever value you give it and a delimiter, and then it's returning that total string that it's created wherever you need it. All right, so let's go over to our front end. And in this case, I'm going to go to a report, and we'll look at this very briefly. So here we have our sections. As you know, I always like to look at whatever sections are on the report when I first come into it. And in this case, we have our page header, no big deal, just used for formatting. And we have a group header order. So that is to say, all of this information is going to be an aggregate per order. You'll also know that I'm using aggregates in a header in our 19.2 release, this is something that is supported here, so I wanted to take advantage of it. I don't have to have a header and a footer if I don't want to. The report itself, pretty simple. We're just looking at the order ID. We're using our built-in ag sum by revenue, and then we're doing a collapsed row. And then if you want more information, we have the date of the order, when the order was required, the time between those two dates. And then what we care about for this report is this formula here. So we've added this custom ag concat formula. And in here, we've just input the product name. So we're not changing the delimiter. We're not doing anything fancy. We're just saying, hey, concatenate up whatever products are on the order. Pretty simple. So when I run the report, I have my list of order IDs. I can see the revenue each one's generated, and then I can pick one, and I can see what products were on the order. In this case, it looks like there were 2 products, and I can go through, and you can see, you know, all of the concatenated fields here. So this, of course, is a much easier user experience if a user wants a concatenated list of values. This is all they have to do is type ag concat and then provide the thing that they want concatenated. And of course, they can change that delimiter because we set our code up to support that. Okay. I want to pause there. Does anyone have any questions so far? Okay, great. So cruising through the example, let's go to an example that's a little more complicated and a little more interesting. So the second one is an example that we're calling ag word cloud. And in this case, our goal is to take an input of values. And the inspiration here was that since we've already concatenated together a list of values in our first example, what if we wanted to take that list of values and do something with it? So in this case, we thought, hey, if we have a list of text values, what's an interesting thing you can do? Well, you can turn it into a word cloud. Everyone's seen word clouds, you know, online and educational resources. It's a cool way of visualizing sort of text data. The one disclaimer I want to put here, I should probably actually have 2. First of all, this currently only supports HTML output. When we go through the code, I'll explain why, but that's something I just want to mention here. And then the second disclaimer is that this example is going to use a piece of open source software that's not built or provided by Exago. We're doing this strictly just for an example of how you could use this function using your own custom code. So this isn't something we provide or you know, are packaging for any commercial use here. So I just wanted to mention that as we go. And specifically, if you are interested, we're using from the Codeplex archive, we're using the word cloud that you can get it from NuGet. We just downloaded the source so we could look at it a little easier and get the DLL that we can bundle in here. Okay, so this example is going to be a little more complex, so we'll go through it. But the same way we did the last one, we'll just line by line look through and explain what the code's doing, why we wrote it, how we did. So to start with, name and description, no big deal, right? Ag word cloud. In this case, we didn't use a language ID. If we wanted this to be a translatable description, of course, that's a supported thing here, but I just wanted to mention that. The other thing to mention is I put this in my other category in my formulas because I didn't want it to appear as an aggregate. I wanted this to be something sort of moved over to where it says other. The return type is a string, and this is part of the reason that this is HTML only, but again, I'll talk to that in a little bit. And then if we look at the arguments here, we have the same data to aggregate and record level. I didn't give any of these arguments a description. We could do that if we want to, but they're pretty straightforward. And then the height and width, those are just optional settings if a user wants to manually decide the height and width. Okay, so in terms of references and namespaces, the few things we did differently here, we do have some references. So we have some system references, particularly the system drawing, system collections, and system link. We also have this word cloud DLL. So we took the open source project, we downloaded the project, we built it, and then we took the DLL, we just moved it into the bin directory of Exago. So that's something, you know, you can add your own DLLs as you see fit. as you need to and make references to them. And then in the namespaces, corresponding to these references, we added some additional things here. So here we added system collections generic, system drawing, and then word cloud gen equals wordcloud.wordcloud, right? So these references help us use the code we've mentioned up above, and we're going to use those as we write our custom code. Awesome, so we're building on our class, and this is implementing that interface. So the structure of this is going to be similar, but we're going to do some more sophisticated things with it. So this class, whenever it's instantiated, is going to have a couple of things, just like we had a string builder before. We're going to have, in this case, 3 variables. So the first one is we're going to have a dictionary, and this dictionary is just going to keep track of strings and ints. We're going to call this a frequency dictionary. I'll talk about that in just a moment. And then we have a int for a height and a width. This is just so the user can pass in the size if they want to change the size of the word cloud. So the reason we're keeping a frequency dictionary is what we're going to do is have the user pass in a value, and then we're going to want to keep track of what values they've passed in and how many times we've seen each value. When we see the word clouds, that'll make a lot more sense. So down here, we're going to look first at our add value function. So this is what we do every time we're aggregating the data. And of course, it has the same inputs. These are always going to have the same signature, so no questions there. But the arguments array is actually going to have a couple of additional things. So if there are 2 passed in arguments, that's going to be our height and our width. So we're just going to say, hey, if this is length 2, do a try parse, make sure those are both numbers, and if so, set the height and width variables for this class to the values up above. Right? Pretty simple, just taking advantage of those optional inputs. Again, we're going to skip blanks because a word cloud with blank or empty words doesn't make much sense visually. But then we're going to say if the frequency dictionary contains a key, and in this case we're doing a 2 lower because we're sort of picturing that all the values here, case is not relevant. If you think things are case relevant, of course you can change that. If it contains a key, all we're doing is we're saying, great, for that key, get the value and increment the value. So we're just keeping track of how many times we've seen that particular word. And if it doesn't contain the key, well, that's the first time we've seen the word. So what we're doing is we're adding that key to the dictionary, and we're just setting the initial value at 1 because this is the first time we've seen it. So this add value function is just going to take all these aggregate inputs, and it's just going to keep track of everything in a dictionary. And at the end, we're going to have a dictionary with every key we've seen and how many times we've seen it. So then when we're ready to aggregate, what we're going to do is we're going to take that result, that dictionary, and we're going to split it into two lists. So one is the strings, that is to say what values were passed in, and then the other is the frequency. So of course, how many times we've seen each one. And then we're going to pass those 2 strings into our open source project, our word cloud gen. And the nice part is we're using this because it lets us sort of skip the details of how we're generating this. So this can really be an example for any industry specific custom calculations you want to make, right? We're just passing in values to this referenced DLL, and then it can do whatever it wants. And in this case, it's giving us back an image. So once we have this object with these passed in values, we're then using a built-in method called draw to get an image. We're converting that image to a byte array, and then we're using an Exago class called UDF load image, and then we're returning to Exago, and this is why this is HTML only. In this case, we're returning the HTML for that image. So here, we're just returning it as an image tag in HTML as a base 64 encoded string. So I will note this is why we have that disclaimer and the limitation about PDF, Excel, etc. is because the custom aggregate functions currently, the return types are strings, integers, decimals, and dates. So we're sort of working around a limitation here, but this is a clever thing to do, and I thought it's going to show well, so I wanted to show it even though we are hitting up against that. Okay, so With that, I just want to pause. Does anyone have any questions so far about the code, the add value or the result functions, about how we built this dictionary or anything we've done here? Okay, great. So let's see it live because that's the more interesting part here. So we're gonna edit this other report. In this report, pretty simple. We have a header section on country, and we have a footer section on country. And in that footer section, we are using our custom aggregate formula, no surprise there. But what we're actually passing into it is we're saying, hey, give me the name of the month that each order was made. And so the goal of this report is to build a word cloud that for each country shows, what months had more orders in them in sort of an interesting visual way. Of course, we could build a chart that shows something similar, but I wanted to do this because I thought it was sort of neat. And then in the report footer section, we're doing the same thing, but instead of using the customer's country, we're just saying global preferences, right? So if we aggregate this across all of the countries in our data set here, we can just do global preferences. Now, I will note, just for sort of brevity of the report, because I want to be able to easily get to the end, I did add a filter. So we're actually only looking at 2 countries, but of course we can change up filters. We've covered that in past labs extensively. Awesome. So the first one here, we run the report, and in this case, I have Belgium. So it's showing me sort of the months, and smaller months appear less, larger months appear more. So you can see the difference, right? In by country, different months are going to be more popular. So it looks like April's not particularly popular in Belgium, but in Canada, it's one of the more prominent ones as opposed to March and August. But then if you look at that across both countries, you'll see certain months start to stand out more, and of course, some stand out less as they're smaller. So this is sort of a neat example of taking one of those aggregates and building it a little more visually as well. Again, I just want to pause here to see if anyone has any questions on the code. I know I mentioned this would be a fairly tech heavy lab. We went through a little bit of code there, so I just want to pause, make sure everyone's okay. Awesome. So the last piece here, I want to mention is there are obviously other use cases. This is meant to be a feature that is extensible, that you can do a lot of really cool things with. So we just brainstormed a few. I don't have built-in examples to show, but I wanted to mention. So we have an ag distinct sum. So if you wanted to say, do an ag sum, but you only wanted to use values that were distinct for whatever reason you might have in the reports, you could build a custom function that does that. You could do something similar to what we've already done where with the word cloud example, so you could keep a dictionary of distinct values and you could total each one, or you could only have that value once. You could do an ag sum if. So we've done this using Exago built-in functions, nesting if functions into ag sum functions. We've done this in a lot of different labs before, but this is something you could build in using custom ags. And you could also take a custom aggregate like we've done, and instead of building an image or a word cloud, you could take that data set, instead of tracking it in dictionary, maybe you could add it into a data table or some other sort of structure as you go. And then you could do projections or additional trend values. You could apply other libraries as you see fit. So one of my questions to everyone here, at the end of each support lab, you have a survey. One of the things I want to hear from you is how would you use custom aggregates? Are there cool examples that you're thinking of and you'd like to see, or questions on how you could use it? Do you have use cases in mind? So when you leave the webinar today, you'll have a survey. As always, we always appreciate feedback, but in that, in any of those sort of spaces where you have additional blank text, feel free to write in, hey, I just thought you could do a custom aggregate that does X, Y, and Z. We would always love to hear from you guys on how you use our extensibility. And with that, I'm talking about the end of the lab, so I'll just mention we do have our monthly labs planned out into the summer. So coming up in April, we'll be revisiting linked reports. So we'll be showing how to link reports, hyperlinks, and sort of retouching on those subjects. It's been a while since we've covered them in a lab. We'll also be showing some other new 19.2 features where you can link to dashboards. In May, we're going to do another deep technical dive. This one's going to go pretty extensively through a really cool component architecturally of our application called the scheduler queue. That's going to be a really neat one. I'm excited for it. And then in June, we have our scheduled reports revisited. So we've talked about scheduling reports before, but again, we want to showcase some new capabilities and recap features as well. And then in July, we're going to do a coverage of our v20.1, so our first major release of the year. We're going to be covering a major new feature called storage management. You may have talked to your customer success manager about it already. You may have heard from our product team about it already, but we're going to cover it in detail. We're going to talk about converting from past versions onto this new feature and how it works and some of the benefits, show you the ins and outs and make sure it's really thoroughly covered. So those will be really neat support labs to look forward to. So we got these four, but of course, if there's ever a topic, if there's ever a report, use case, or anything that you're like, hey, I'd love to see a support lab on that, we've got a backlog of 50 of them that we've already covered. But if you ever want to see another one, please, in that survey, go ahead and suggest it. We're always looking for good ideas on labs. So with that, I'll pause once again for any questions. I'm a little surprised we didn't have any today, so coming through, hopefully everything nice and clear and everyone can hear me okay. But with that, if you don't have any questions, we'll end the lab here, and I'll just say thanks for attending and happy reporting.